3 hours east of Seattle sits the most contaminated piece of land in the United States, a fenced federal reservation the size of half a county, holding 56 million gallons of radioactive waste inside aging underground tanks, several of which are actively leaking into the ground right now as you watch this. Beneath the streets of Seattle itself, an entire buried city sits sealed and largely inaccessible, the literal ground floor of the original downtown, abandoned in place after a catastrophic fire and simply built over rather than dug out. This video counts down 9 real underground and restricted places in Washington state, all of them documented in Washington State Department of Ecology records, Department of Energy filings, or National Register of Historic Places archives. Several are actively guarded around the clock. One of them requires a $2,400 million a year federal cleanup effort just to keep from getting worse. Stay with me to the end, because the final site on this list produced roughly 2/3 of the plutonium used in America's entire Cold War nuclear arsenal, and the cleanup, which began in 1989, is still not expected to be finished for decades. Let's begin. At approximately 2:20 in the afternoon on June 6, 1889, an overturned glue pot in a Seattle cabinet shop started a fire that would destroy roughly 31 city blocks of the young frontier city, most of it built from wood on soggy tide-flat ground that offered the flames almost nothing to slow them down. In the aftermath, city officials made an unusual decision. Rather than simply rebuild at the original street level, they would raise the streets themselves by as much as 35 feet in places, improving drainage on land that had always struggled with it, while property owners rebuilt their storefronts below at the old ground level. For years, pedestrians navigated a strange transitional cityscape of ladders and boardwalks connecting the old sidewalks to the new elevated streets above, until permanent sidewalks were finally built at the new grade, sealing the original ground floor storefronts, doorways, and street level beneath the city that replaced them. What had once been Seattle's bustling commercial district became, almost overnight, a dim, mostly forgotten underground space, and by the early 20th century it had largely fallen into disuse and disrepair, associated more with illicit activity than commerce. The Seattle Underground sat forgotten for decades until a local writer named Bill Speidel began offering informal walking tours in 1965, sparking a preservation movement that helped save the surrounding Pioneer Square neighborhood from demolition. Guided tours operate today through a limited, structurally maintained portion of the underground, but the overwhelming majority of the buried city extends far beyond the tour route, closed to the public and, in many sections, condemned by the city as structurally unsafe, an entire vanished downtown sitting in the dark beneath the streets that Seattle residents walk every single day. On the shores of Hood Canal in Kitsap County, Naval Base Kitsap's Bangor installation serves as home port to a significant portion of the United States Navy's fleet of Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines. Vessels that together carry a substantial share of the entire American nuclear deterrent aboard Trident missiles capable of striking targets anywhere on Earth. The base includes the Strategic Weapons Facility Pacific, a heavily secured complex responsible for the storage, maintenance, and loading of the nuclear warheads carried aboard the submarines stationed there, one of only 2 such facilities in the entire United States. The security protocols surrounding Bangor's weapons storage and handling facilities rank among the most stringent of any military installation in the country, involving multiple layers of armed protection, restricted airspace, and a security perimeter that has, on more than one occasion, been the site of civil disobedience actions by anti-nuclear protesters attempting to draw attention to the base's role in the American nuclear arsenal. Several of these demonstrations, some dating back decades, resulted in federal prosecutions after activists breached outer perimeter fencing, underscoring both the base's symbolic significance and the seriousness with which the Navy treats any unauthorized approach to its most sensitive facilities. The specific underground and hardened storage infrastructure at the Strategic Weapons Facility Pacific remains almost entirely undisclosed to the public, consistent with standard federal practice for nuclear weapons storage sites nationwide. What is publicly documented is simply the base's scale and mission, a facility on the shores of a quiet Pacific Northwest waterway, surrounded by forest and small coastal towns, that plays a central role in maintaining the underwater leg of the United States nuclear triad, hidden behind fences that most nearby residents have driven past for years without any specific knowledge of what lies within them. Before we go further, it's worth understanding why Washington state in particular combines this much buried infrastructure, from a literal vanished downtown to some of the most secured nuclear facilities in the country, because the pattern reflects three very different chapters of the state's history compressed into a relatively small geographic area. Seattle's underground exists because of a frontier-era disaster and a uniquely pragmatic civic response to it, a story rooted entirely in 19th-century urban development rather than any deliberate secrecy. But the deeper, more consequential layer of Washington's restricted underground history comes from the 20th century, when the state's combination of abundant hydroelectric power, available river water for cooling, and remote, sparsely populated land made it one of the most strategically important locations in the entire country for the most secretive weapons programs the federal government ever ran. The same qualities that made the Hanford area attractive for plutonium production in the 1940s, remoteness, water and power, later made Puget Sound's sheltered deep-water inlets attractive for basing the Navy's most sensitive nuclear submarine fleet during the Cold War. Layered across all of this is Washington's rugged natural geography itself, the Cascade Range's volcanic terrain and lava tube caves, and the legacy of more than a century of hard rock mining in the mountains east of Puget Sound. Washington's restricted underground spaces, in other words, emerged from three overlapping forces arriving in different centuries: a frontier city's practical response to fire, a mid-century weapons program that needed exactly what the state's geography offered, and a natural landscape shaped by volcanic activity that created its own separate category of underground terrain worth protecting. In the forested slopes of the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument, Ape Cave stretches for more than 2 miles through a lava tube formed roughly 2,000 years ago, making it one of the longest continuous lava tubes in the continental United States and one of the most popular cave destinations in the Pacific Northwest. The cave and dozens of other lava tube systems scattered across the volcanic terrain of southwestern Washington have, like cave systems across much of the rest of the country, come under increasing seasonal and area-specific access restrictions in recent years as land managers work to protect the bat populations that use them for hibernation. The threat driving these closures is the now familiar spread of white nose syndrome, the fungal disease that has devastated bat populations across North America since its initial detection in the mid-2000s. Washington state recorded its first confirmed case of the disease in 2016, one of the earliest detections west of the Rocky Mountains, a discovery that alarmed wildlife officials specifically because it suggested the fungus had somehow been transported thousands of miles beyond its previously documented range, likely through human activity rather than the slower, more predictable spread of infected bats moving between nearby caves. In response, the U.S. Forest Service and Washington's Department of Fish and Wildlife have implemented targeted seasonal closures and mandatory decontamination protocols at cave sites across the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest and other volcanic cave systems in the region, an effort to slow a disease that had already, by the time it reached Washington, killed millions of bats across the eastern half of the country. The closures represent a relatively young and still evolving front in Washington's underground restrictions, driven not by weapons programs or urban disasters, but by an invisible fungal threat that arrived in the Pacific Northwest years after it was first detected on the opposite side of the continent. If you're finding this hidden side of Washington state as interesting as we are, we'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button and consider subscribing. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Now, let's keep going. The Grand Coulee Dam, spanning the Columbia River in north-central Washington, is the largest concrete structure and the largest hydroelectric power producer in the United States, an engineering project so massive that its construction throughout the 1930s and early 1940s employed thousands of workers and fundamentally reshaped the regional economy of the entire Columbia Basin. Beyond the dam's famous face and spillway, its interior contains extensive underground infrastructure, turbine galleries, maintenance tunnels, and control facilities built directly into and beneath the structure, engineering necessary to operate a facility generating enough electricity to power several major cities simultaneously. Grand Coulee's massive electrical output played a specific and largely unpublicized role during the Second World War. The dam's power was quietly diverted to supply the enormous energy demands of the Hanford site's plutonium production reactors, roughly 140 miles downstream, a connection that was not publicly disclosed at the time given the secrecy surrounding the Manhattan Project. In effect, the electricity generated in Grand Coulee's underground turbine halls helped power the reactors that produced the plutonium used in the first atomic bomb ever tested, and the bomb dropped on Nagasaki, a wartime connection between two of Washington's most significant pieces of infrastructure that remained classified for years after the war ended. Access to Grand Coulee's underground operational areas, including its turbine galleries and control infrastructure, remains restricted to Bureau of Reclamation personnel and authorized visitors on limited guided tours, a policy driven by both the genuine industrial hazards of an active hydroelectric facility and the dam's ongoing status as a piece of critical national infrastructure. The Public Visitor Center offers views of the dam's exterior and a limited underground tour route, but the vast majority of the facility's interior, including the turbine halls that once helped power an atomic weapons program without anyone downstream knowing it, remains closed to casual visitors. Scattered through the Cascade Mountains east of Puget Sound, the remains of more than a century of hard rock mining sit largely forgotten in some of Washington's most rugged and remote wilderness terrain. Monte Cristo, in the mountains northeast of Everett, was once a booming gold and silver mining town accessible only by rail, its underground workings extending deep into the surrounding peaks before the mines proved less profitable than investors had hoped, and the town was largely abandoned by the early 20th century, leaving behind sealed mine shafts and decaying structures that hikers occasionally encounter along wilderness trails today. Further north, in the North Cascades near Lake Chelan, the Holden Mine operated as a major copper mining operation from the 1930s through the 1950s, extracting significant quantities of copper, zinc and gold from underground workings before the operation closed, and the mine tailings were left in place for decades, eventually contaminating nearby Railroad Creek with heavy metals at levels serious enough to warrant a major federal Superfund cleanup effort that began in the early 2000s and continued for years, addressing contamination in one of the most remote and pristine wilderness areas anywhere in the state. Both sites illustrate a pattern common to abandoned mining infrastructure throughout the Cascades: sealed shafts and adits scattered across genuinely difficult-to-reach mountain terrain, some marked with warning signage, many simply left as they were when the last miners walked away, presenting an ongoing but low-visibility hazard in a mountain range better known today for hiking and recreation than for the underground industry that once drew thousands of workers into some of the most isolated corners of the entire state. In the high desert of south-central Washington, along a bend of the Columbia River, the B reactor at the Hanford site holds a place in history that few industrial structures anywhere in the world can match. It was the first full-scale nuclear reactor ever built for plutonium production, completed in an astonishing 13 months in 1944 as part of the Manhattan Project's urgent wartime effort to produce material for an atomic weapon. The reactor successfully produced the plutonium used in the Trinity test, the first ever detonation of a nuclear weapon, and in the bomb dropped on Nagasaki just weeks later, making B reactor arguably as consequential to the outcome of the Second World War as any single piece of American industrial infrastructure built during the entire conflict. B reactor continued operating for more than 2 decades after the war, eventually shut down in 1968 as newer, more efficient reactors at Hanford took over plutonium production duties. Rather than being demolished, the reactor was preserved, and it was designated a National Historic Landmark in 2008, eventually becoming part of the Manhattan Project National Historical Park, established in 2015, one of the few Manhattan Project facilities anywhere in the country accessible to the public through scheduled tours. Visiting B reactor requires advance reservation through the National Park Service and Department of Energy, and access is limited to guided tour groups escorted through a small portion of the surrounding Hanford site, which otherwise remains a closed federal reservation. The reactor that helped end the Second World War now sits as a strange kind of monument in the middle of an active nuclear cleanup site, one preserved piece of history surrounded by tens of square miles of restricted, still contaminated land that most visitors touring the reactor itself will never see beyond the bus windows. Beneath the surface of the Hanford site, 177 massive underground tanks hold approximately 56 million gallons of highly radioactive and chemically hazardous waste, the accumulated byproduct of more than 4 decades of plutonium production that, at its peak, processed more than 100,000 tons of uranium to produce roughly 75 tons of plutonium, accounting for about 2/3 of the entire United States Cold War plutonium stockpile. The tanks, built in groups called tank farms and buried with only 7 to 10 feet of soil covering their tops for radiation shielding, were never intended to hold this waste permanently. Most were designed for a functional lifespan of 20 to 25 years, and many have now been in continuous service for well over 60. The consequences of that extended service life are exactly what engineers feared. State and federal monitoring has determined that dozens of the older single-shell tanks have leaked over the decades, and as recently as 2024, the Department of Energy confirmed that at least 3 tanks were actively leaking radioactive and chemically hazardous material into the soil beneath them, raising ongoing concern about contamination, eventually reaching the nearby Columbia River, one of the most significant waterways in the entire Pacific Northwest. Washington's Department of Ecology has pursued legal action against the federal government for years over the pace and adequacy of the cleanup effort, a conflict between state environmental regulators and the Department of Energy that has continued for decades without full resolution. In 2025, after years of delay, workers began the first stage of vitrification, a process designed to mix the tank waste with glass-forming material and melt it into a stable glass form for long-term storage, a milestone officials described as one of the most important achievements in the entire history of the Hanford cleanup. Even with that progress, retrieving, treating, and permanently disposing of 56 million gallons of tank waste remains a project expected to continue for decades more. An underground hazard that will likely still be actively managed by engineers not yet born when the last of the original tanks finally closes for good. The Hanford site occupies roughly 586 square miles of high desert along the Columbia River in southeastern Washington, an area larger than the city of Los Angeles, established in 1943 as part of the Manhattan Project, specifically because its combination of abundant river water for reactor cooling, hydroelectric power from nearby dams, and remote isolation from major population centers made it ideal for the country's first large-scale plutonium production complex. Over more than 4 decades of operation, Hanford's 9 reactors and associated chemical processing facilities produce the majority of the plutonium used in the entire American nuclear weapons stockpile, a mission carried out with a level of urgency and secrecy during the war years that left environmental and safety considerations, by any modern standard, a distant second priority. The consequences of that priority are what make Hanford, by most measures, the most contaminated single site in the entire United States today. Beyond the underground waste tanks, decades of operations released radioactive and chemical contamination directly into the air, into unlined trenches, and directly into the ground, with estimates from watchdog organizations putting the total volume of waste generated at Hanford at hundreds of billions of gallons across the site's operational history. Cleanup work began in 1989, jointly overseen by the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, and Washington State, and it currently costs more than $2 billion annually, employing roughly 12,000 people, a workforce larger than the plutonium production program itself employed at various points during the Cold War. There is no publicly announced date by which Hanford's cleanup is expected to be fully complete. Major milestones like the 2025 start of tank waste vitrification arrive after years or decades of delay, and officials candidly describe the remaining work in terms of decades rather than years. The site that once raced against wartime deadlines to produce plutonium in record time now operates on an entirely different kind of timeline, one where progress is measured in single, hard-won steps toward undoing what half a century of urgent, secretive production left behind in the ground. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with us through the full story of Washington's hidden and dangerous underground history. If you found these places as fascinating as we did, please consider subscribing. We cover more of America's hidden and restricted history every week, and we'd love to have you along for the next one.